The warm glow of the diner's neon sign flickered against the dark evening sky as Daniel Carter pushed open the glass door. The scent of sizzling burgers and freshly brewed coffee wrapped around him, a familiar embrace he hadn't felt in years. To the staff and customers, he was just another man looking for a meal after a long day. No one recognized him as the owner, the CEO who had built this small chain from the ground up. He slid into a booth near the window, keeping his cap low. Tonight, he wasn't here to check numbers or evaluate performance reports. He wanted to see the truth, the real experience of the place he had once dreamed of as a young entrepreneur. Had his vision held up? Were his employees treated well? He needed to know. A young waitress approached with a tired but polite smile. "Good evening. What can I get for you?" Her name tag read Emily. She couldn't have been more than 20, yet there was something about her eyes, like she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her voice was soft, polite, but there was an exhaustion behind it that made Daniel pause. He ordered a simple cheeseburger and fries, watching as she scribbled it down before hurrying off to the kitchen. As he waited, he glanced around. The diner was busier than he expected for a weekday night. A few families laughed over plates of pancakes, an elderly man sipped coffee at the counter, and a group of teenagers debated over milkshake flavors. The atmosphere seemed warm, but something felt off. Then he heard it. A muffled sob from the kitchen. Daniel stiffened. It was faint, barely audible over the clatter of dishes, but it was there. A soft, broken sound like someone trying to hold themselves together. His gaze flicked toward the swinging door that led to the back. A moment later, Emily reappeared, her eyes slightly red as she forced a smile for the next table. She moved quickly, avoiding eye contact, but Daniel noticed the way her hands trembled as she set down a plate. Something was wrong. He had come here to see his business from the ground level, to witness the day-to-day life of his employees. But now, he was seeing something he hadn't expected. And he wasn't leaving until he found out the truth. Daniel took a slow sip of his water, his mind turning. He hadn't expected to find a mystery when he walked into his own diner. He had simply wanted to see the place through the eyes of an ordinary customer, to understand what it felt like to sit at a booth, place an order, and watch the staff move through their shifts. But now something felt wrong. The sound of Emily's quiet sobs from the kitchen wouldn't leave his head. She moved between tables, balancing trays with careful precision, offering the same tired smile to every customer. To most people, she would seem like any other hardworking waitress. But Daniel had spent years learning to read people. Business partners, investors, employees. And right now he could see it. Emily was struggling with something. His food arrived a few minutes later, placed on the table by an older waitress with graying hair and kind eyes. "Here you go, hon," she said with a warm smile before walking away. Daniel glanced toward the kitchen doors again. His appetite suddenly gone. Something told him Emily wouldn't just open up to a stranger, so he decided to observe instead. He took his time eating, watching the way she moved through the diner. She was quick, efficient, but there were moments when she seemed distracted, almost as if she was somewhere else entirely. A few times, he caught her wiping at her eyes when she thought no one was looking. Then he noticed something else. The manager, a tall man in his late 40s, stood near the counter. His arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Daniel hadn't met every manager personally, but he knew who was in charge of each location. This one, Rick, if he remembered correctly, had been with the company for nearly 3 years. Rick's gaze followed Emily closely. Daniel's grip tightened around his fork as he watched the way the manager's eyes lingered on her, the way his mouth pressed into a thin line whenever she was near. Something about it didn't sit right. Then, as Emily passed him on her way to the kitchen, Rick muttered something under his breath. Daniel didn't hear the words, but he saw the way Emily flinched, her whole body stiffening for just a second before she hurried through the swinging doors. Daniel set his fork down. He had seen enough. Finishing the last few bites of his meal, he pulled out his wallet and left a generous tip on the table. He wasn't leaving, not yet, but he wanted to avoid drawing attention to himself. Moving toward the counter, he handed his bill to the cashier, keeping his voice calm as he spoke. "Restroom?" he asked casually. The cashier, a young man with a bored expression, pointed toward the back. "Right past the kitchen doors." Daniel nodded his thanks and walked in that direction, keeping his pace relaxed. As he neared the doors, he could hear the low hum of voices inside. He hesitated for just a moment before pushing the door open slightly, just enough to see inside without being noticed. Emily stood near the sink, gripping the edge of the counter, her head bowed. Her shoulders were tense, her breathing uneven. Rick stood behind her, his arms crossed, his tone sharp. "I don't care what your excuse is, Emily. You don't just disappear in the middle of a shift. Customers come first. Do you understand?" Emily nodded quickly, blinking back tears. "Yes, sir. I'm sorry. It won't happen again." Rick let out a sigh, shaking his head. "You've been slacking lately. If you don't want this job, just say so." Daniel's jaw tightened. He had seen enough bad managers in his years running this business to know the signs. Rick wasn't leading, he was intimidating. He wasn't guiding, he was breaking her down. Emily swallowed hard. "I do want this job." Rick studied her for a long moment before scoffing. "Then prove it." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, pushing past Daniel without even noticing him. Daniel stepped forward as Emily wiped at her face quickly, trying to compose herself. She turned back toward the counter, nearly bumping into him as she did. Her eyes widened slightly in surprise. "Oh, sorry, I didn't see you there," she said, forcing a quick smile. Daniel hesitated for a brief moment before speaking, his voice calm. "Are you okay?" The question caught her off guard. For a second, her expression wavered, as if she wanted to say something. But just as quickly, she masked it with another polite smile. "I'm fine. Just a long shift, that's all." Daniel nodded slowly, though he didn't believe her. He could tell she was holding back, choosing her words carefully. Whatever was happening here, she wasn't ready to talk about it. "I'll get out of your way," he said, stepping back toward the door. Emily gave him a small nod before turning away, but Daniel could still see the tension in her shoulders. As he walked out of the kitchen, he knew one thing for certain: something was very wrong in this diner. And he wasn't about to walk away without finding out what. Daniel returned to his seat, but his focus was no longer on the half-empty plate in front of him. His mind replayed the scene in the kitchen: Emily's shaking hands, Rick's harsh tone, the way she had flinched at his words. He had built this diner with the idea that it would be a place where employees felt valued, where customers felt welcome. But what he had just witnessed felt wrong. It wasn't how things were supposed to be. As he stirred his now cold coffee, he kept his eyes on the restaurant floor. Rick had resumed his spot near the counter, arms crossed as he scanned the room with an expression of quiet authority. Emily had returned to waiting tables, but there was a stiffness to her movements now, like she was afraid of making a mistake. Daniel had seen people like Rick before. Managers who thought fear was the best way to keep control. He knew that type well. They always kept their true nature just below the surface, careful to avoid doing anything outright illegal but making sure their employees knew who held the power. He watched as an elderly couple waved Emily over. She put on a smile and took their order, her voice polite but distant. It was only when she walked back toward the kitchen that Daniel noticed something odd. Her hands were empty. She hadn't written anything down. A moment later, the same older waitress who had brought Daniel's food hurried to the counter and began preparing drinks. That's when it clicked. Emily hadn't been taking orders. She was passing them off. She was avoiding the kitchen. Daniel's stomach twisted. He didn't know what had happened back there before he arrived, but it was clear that Emily didn't want to be alone in that space. The realization only added more weight to the uneasy feeling in his chest. His thoughts were interrupted when the door jingled, and a young man in a hoodie walked in. He looked about Emily's age, maybe a little older, with tired eyes and a tense posture. He glanced around, his gaze settling on Emily almost instantly. Her back was turned, but something about the way the young man hesitated at the entrance made Daniel watch closely. The young man finally stepped inside and made his way to a corner booth. Emily turned, and the moment her eyes landed on him, her expression changed. It was subtle, but Daniel saw it. The slight widening of her eyes, the quick inhale, the way she gripped her tray just a little tighter. She hesitated, then walked toward him. Daniel leaned back in his seat, listening as best as he could without making it obvious. Emily stopped by the table, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" The young man, Ethan, frowned. "I've been trying to call you. You haven't answered." Emily glanced over her shoulder, her expression uneasy. "I told you I can't." Ethan cut her off. "Is he still giving you trouble?" His voice was low, but Daniel caught the concern in it. Emily didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked toward the counter where Rick was talking to the cashier, completely unaware of their conversation. She exhaled and turned back to Ethan. "Please just go. I can't do this right now." Ethan looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. Instead, he slid something across the table. A folded piece of paper. "If you need a way out, call this number. They can help." Emily hesitated before slowly taking it, her fingers closing around the paper. She gave Ethan a look that was hard to read. Gratitude, maybe, but also fear. Then she quickly slipped the note into her apron pocket and turned away, hurrying toward the back. Daniel kept his gaze on Ethan, who let out a frustrated breath and ran a hand through his hair. The way he looked at Emily wasn't just concern, it was personal. Something deeper was going on here. Daniel didn't believe in coincidences. If Ethan was here, if he was warning Emily about something, then the situation was worse than he had thought. As Daniel took one last sip of his coffee, he made a decision. He had come here to see how his business was running, but now this was about something more. He couldn't just walk away. Something was happening in his diner, and he was going to find out exactly what it was. Daniel didn't leave. He couldn't. Not after what he had seen. The way Emily had reacted to Ethan, the way she had pocketed that piece of paper like it was her only lifeline. It all pointed to something deeper, something she was too afraid to say out loud. He had built this diner from the ground up. It was supposed to be a place where people felt safe, where employees were treated fairly. But as he watched Emily move through the restaurant, forcing a smile while avoiding Rick's gaze, he realized that somewhere along the way, something had gone wrong. Rick leaned against the counter, flipping through his phone, completely unaware that Daniel had been watching him for the past hour. He acted like a man who knew he wouldn't be questioned, like someone who had power and knew how to use it. Daniel clenched his jaw. That was about to change. A few minutes later, Emily stepped into the back again, and Rick followed. This time, Daniel didn't hesitate. He stood, walking casually toward the kitchen doors, pushing through just enough to see inside without being noticed. Rick was standing too close to her. Emily's back was pressed against the counter, her hands gripping the edge like she was trying to steady herself. Her face was pale, and Daniel could see her shoulders rise and fall with uneven breaths. Rick's voice was low, but Daniel could hear the sharpness in it. "You think you can keep ignoring me?" Emily shook her head quickly. I'm just trying to work. I don't want any trouble." Rick scoffed. "Trouble? You brought that on yourself the second you thought you could make demands." Daniel's fists tightened at his sides. He didn't know the full story yet, but he didn't need to. He had seen enough. Before he could step in, the back door of the kitchen swung open. Ethan. His face was tense, his hands clenched as he stormed inside. "Leave her alone." Rick turned, a slow, amused smile creeping onto his face. "You really think you should be here, kid?" Emily's eyes widened. "Ethan, don't." Ethan ignored her. "I warned you before. You don't get to treat people like this." Rick let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. You're not even supposed to be here. Unless you want me calling the cops, I suggest you walk back out that door. Daniel's eyes flicked between them, the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together. Ethan wasn't just a concerned friend. He had been here before. He knew Rick. And whatever had happened between them, it wasn't over. Emily stepped between them, her voice desperate. Please, Ethan, just go. But Ethan didn't move. Neither did Rick. The tension in the air was thick, like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting to see who would make the first move. Daniel knew he couldn't wait any longer. He stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. That's enough. All three of them turned toward him, startled. Rick's eyes narrowed. Who the hell are you? Daniel met his gaze, steady and unflinching. A customer. And I don't like what I'm seeing. Rick let out a short laugh. This is none of your business. Why don't you finish your meal and get out of here? Daniel took another step forward, lowering his voice. And if I don't? Rick's smile faltered slightly. Ethan looked between them, his jaw tightening. Emily was staring at Daniel now like she was seeing him for the first time, really seeing him. Like she knew he wasn't just another diner customer anymore. Rick exhaled, rubbing his temples as if this whole thing was a mild inconvenience. Look, I don't have time for this. Emily, get back to work. And you? He pointed at Ethan. I see you here again and I will call the cops. Emily nodded quickly, stepping back toward the door, her face pale. Ethan hesitated, anger flickering in his eyes, but eventually turned to leave. Daniel didn't move. Rick gave him a hard stare. You still here? Daniel met his gaze. For now. Rick scoffed and walked past him, pushing through the doors back into the restaurant. Daniel waited a few seconds, then turned to Emily. Her hands were still trembling. Ethan stood frozen near the door, torn between leaving and staying. Daniel looked at her carefully. Is he telling the truth? Do you want me to leave this alone? For a long moment she didn't answer. She stared down at the ground, her breath shaky. Then with the faintest whisper she said, No. Daniel nodded. Then I won't. Emily finally lifted her eyes to his, a mixture of fear and relief in them. Ethan exhaled, rubbing his face like he had been holding in frustration for too long. Daniel knew then that whatever was happening here wasn't just about a bad boss. It was bigger than that. And he had just stepped right into the middle of it. But he wasn't going anywhere. Not until he got to the truth. Daniel didn't look away from Emily. Her whispered words still lingered in the air, fragile but certain. She didn't want him to leave this alone. That meant whatever was happening here was worse than what he had already seen. Ethan let out a slow breath, his frustration barely contained. Emily, you should just leave. Right now. We can go together. His voice was urgent, pleading. Emily shook her head quickly. I can't, Ethan. You know I can't. Daniel could see it in her eyes. Fear, but also something deeper. Something holding her back. Why? He asked softly. She hesitated. Her fingers twitched at her sides as if she wanted to say something but didn't know if she should. She glanced toward the kitchen doors, then at Ethan. Finally, in a low voice, she said, Because of my paycheck. Daniel frowned. Your paycheck? Emily bit her lip, her hesitation cracking just slightly. Rick, he's been holding my money back. He keeps coming up with excuses. Says there were mistakes in my hours, that he needs to verify things before payroll goes through. It's been weeks. I don't have enough to leave. Daniel's jaw tightened. He had heard of this kind of thing before. Shady managers skimming from employee paychecks, keeping workers trapped because they couldn't afford to walk away. It was illegal. It was wrong. And it was happening right under his nose. Ethan cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair. That's what this is about. He's stealing from you, Emily. And you're just letting him. Emily's voice wavered. I don't have a choice. Daniel glanced toward the doors. Rick was back near the counter, laughing with a few of the kitchen staff, completely unconcerned about what had just happened. Do you have proof? Daniel asked. Emily hesitated again before slowly nodding. I keep track of my hours. I write them down every night. And when I checked my bank account today, I was missing over 2 weeks' worth of pay. Ethan clenched his fists. We should call the cops. Emily let out a bitter laugh. And say what? That my manager is, accidentally, delaying my money. He'll just make up another excuse. Say it was a clerical error. That he'll fix it next week. He always does. Daniel's mind was already moving, piecing things together. If Rick had been doing this to Emily, chances were he wasn't just targeting her. He could be skimming from other employees too. And if that was the case, Daniel had far more than just a bad manager on his hands. He had a serious problem within his business. And then another thought hit him. If Rick had been holding Emily's pay hostage, that meant he knew she was desperate. That she couldn't afford to lose this job. And that gave him control. Daniel's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about money. This was about power. Before he could say anything, the kitchen door swung open, and the older waitress, Marie, stepped inside. She stopped short when she saw the three of them huddled together, her sharp eyes scanning their faces. What's going on in here? She asked, her voice low. Emily stiffened. Nothing. Just talking. Marie's gaze lingered on her, then shifted to Daniel. For a second, something flickered in her expression, something like recognition. Then, as if making a decision, she closed the door behind her and lowered her voice. You're Daniel, aren't you? Emily's eyes widened. Ethan looked confused. But Daniel stayed still, studying her carefully. What makes you say that? Marie scoffed. I've been working in diners for 30 years, son. I know when someone doesn't belong. She crossed her arms. What I don't know is why the owner of this place is sitting in my restaurant pretending to be a customer. Emily and Ethan both looked at him, startled. Daniel exhaled slowly. The cover was off. I came here to see how things were running, he admitted. To see the place from a customer's perspective. His expression darkened. And now I see things aren't running the way they should. Marie didn't seem surprised. Yeah, well, that's because Rick's been treating this place like his own personal kingdom. And no one's done a damn thing about it. Daniel's voice was steady. How long has this been going on? Marie hesitated, then sighed. Too long. The missing pay, the way he talks to the girls, the way he fires people for no reason. No one fights back because they need the money. And the ones who do. She shook her head. They don't last long. Ethan's jaw tightened. So you knew. Marie gave him a sharp look. Of course I knew. I've been trying to help in my own way. Covering Emily's tables when she's too shaken up to go back out there. Slipping her a few extra tips when I can. She glanced at Emily. But I can't fix what he's done to you, sweetheart. Not by myself. Daniel took a deep breath, his mind racing. This was bigger than just one person. It was a pattern. And it had gone unchecked for far too long. But before he could speak, a voice echoed from the front of the diner. Emily! Where the hell are you? Vic. Emily flinched. Marie exhaled sharply, giving her a reassuring pat on the shoulder before stepping aside. Go. Before he comes back here. Emily hesitated, glancing at Daniel. There was something in her eyes now. Not just fear but something else. Oh. Like maybe, for the first time, she wasn't completely alone in this. Daniel gave her a slight nod. Go. We'll handle this. Emily swallowed hard, then turned and hurried out of the kitchen. The moment the door swung shut, Marie looked at Daniel. So, boss. He smirked. What's your move? Daniel exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. My move. He glanced at the door. I'm shutting this down. Daniel took a deep breath and pushed open the kitchen doors, stepping into the diner with a quiet but firm presence. His eyes immediately found Rick, who stood near the counter, arms crossed, tapping his fingers impatiently. Emily had just returned to the floor, her hands shaking slightly as she wiped them on her apron. Rick's gaze was locked on her, frustration clear on his face. Daniel moved with purpose, heading straight for the counter. He wasn't going to wait any longer. He had seen enough, heard enough. It was time to put an end to this. Rick barely spared him a glance. "Didn't I tell you to get lost?" Daniel ignored him, instead turning his attention to Emily. "You okay?" His voice was calm, steady. Emily hesitated, glancing at Rick before nodding slightly. But Daniel could see the truth in her eyes. She was exhausted, worn down by fear and uncertainty. Rick let out a short laugh. "Oh, this is cute. The customer playing hero. Listen, pal, I don't know what you think is going on here, but it's none of your business." He turned to Emily, his voice sharp. "Get back to work." Daniel's voice was cool, controlled. "You don't get to talk to her like that." Rick blinked, clearly thrown off by the confidence in Daniel's tone. "Excuse me." Daniel reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. He flipped it open just enough to reveal his business card before sliding it onto the counter between them. The smirk on Rick's face faltered. He picked up the card, his eyes scanning the name. Then, slowly, his expression shifted from confusion to something much more unsettled. Daniel leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only Rick could hear. "You're done." Rick scoffed, but there was an edge of nervousness now. "This some kind of joke?" Daniel straightened, his tone firm. "No joke. I own this place. And I've just spent the last few hours watching you threaten, manipulate, and steal from your employees." He let the words sink in before continuing. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk out that door, and you're not coming back." A hush had fallen over the diner. The other employees were watching now. Their movements slowed as they realized something was happening. Rick let out a forced laugh. "You think you can fire me? Just like that?" Daniel nodded. "Just like that." Rick's jaw clenched. "You don't have proof." Daniel exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "Don't I?" It was then that Marie stepped forward, holding up her phone. "You forgot something, Rick. People have cameras now." Rick's face paled slightly. Marie smirked. "I've been recording this whole time. Every word, every threat, every excuse you gave Emily about her paycheck. Oh, and I have a little collection of past incidents too. Seems like you've been a busy man." Rick's lips parted like he was about to argue, but nothing came out. His hands curled into fists. Daniel crossed his arms. "I could call the cops. I could press charges. But honestly, I just want you gone." Rick's nostrils flared. His eyes darted around the room, as if looking for someone to back him up. But no one did. The employees were watching in silence. Even the customers had caught on to the tension. For the first time, Rick wasn't in control. He let out a slow breath, his jaw tight. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed toward the door. He yanked it open, stepping outside into the cold night air. The second the door swung shut behind him, a heavy silence filled the room. Then, slowly, Marie let out a satisfied sigh. Well, that was long overdue. Emily still looked stunned, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "He's really gone." Daniel nodded. "He's gone." She exhaled, and for the first time that night, her shoulders seemed to relax. A small, disbelieving smile crossed her face. Ethan grinned. "Took you long enough." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. Then he turned to Emily. "We're getting your paycheck sorted first thing in the morning. No more excuses." Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time they weren't from fear. "Thank you," she whispered. Marie patted her shoulder. "I think we'll all be sleeping a little easier tonight." The tension in the diner slowly eased, the employees returning to work, the customers chatting again. But something had shifted. The weight that had hung over the place for so long was finally gone. Daniel glanced around the restaurant. His restaurant. He had come here undercover to see what was wrong. And now he knew. But just as he was about to take a deep breath, The front door swung open again. Vic. Only this time he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a man in a dark suit, with cold eyes and a sharp gaze. He looked past Daniel and straight at Emily. And then, in a voice too calm, too controlled, he said, "Miss Parker, you and I have some unfinished business." The diner fell silent again. Daniel stepped forward instinctively, his heart pounding. This wasn't over yet. The diner went completely silent. Emily stiffened beside Daniel, her breath catching in her throat. The man in the suit didn't move, his gaze fixed solely on her. Even Rick, who had barged back in with so much anger just moments ago, stood slightly behind the man, like he wasn't fully in control anymore. Daniel felt a surge of protectiveness rise in his chest. He stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Emily and the stranger. "Who are you?" His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. The man barely spared Daniel a glance. "This doesn't concern you." Then, in a cold, measured tone, he spoke again, this time directly to Emily. "You know why I'm here." Emily's hands gripped the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. "No, I don't," she said, but her voice wasn't as steady as she wanted it to be. The man sighed as if this were an inconvenience to him. "Let's not do this, Miss Parker. You have something that doesn't belong to you." Daniel's eyes flickered toward Emily. "What is he talking about?" Emily hesitated. It was only for a second, but Daniel caught it. A sinking feeling settled in his stomach. "I don't know," she whispered. The man took a slow step forward. "We can do this the easy way, or—" "She doesn't have anything," Daniel interrupted. His voice was sharper now. "And you're not going to threaten her in my restaurant." The man finally looked at him, really looked at him, his expression shifting slightly. A flicker of recognition. "You're Daniel Carter." It wasn't a question. Daniel didn't react. He wasn't about to confirm or deny anything to a man who had walked in demanding something from his employee. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering something. Then, surprisingly, he took a step back. "Very well," he said smoothly. "But I'll be back. This matter isn't finished." Without another word, he turned and walked out. Rick hesitated for half a second before scrambling after him. The door swung shut behind them, leaving a thick silence in their wake. Emily finally exhaled, her whole body trembling. Marie reached over, gently rubbing her back. "What was that about, sweetheart?" Emily shook her head, but Daniel could tell she wasn't being completely honest. There was something she wasn't saying. He lowered his voice. "Emily, if you're in trouble, I need to know." She looked at him then, her eyes full of emotion she had been holding back for too long. And finally, after what felt like forever, she whispered, "I think I made a mistake." Daniel stayed quiet, letting her gather her thoughts. Emily swallowed hard. "A few weeks ago, I found something in Rick's office. It was a folder full of documents. At first I thought it was just employee paperwork, but then I saw numbers that didn't make sense. Transactions. Money going in and out. Way more than a diner should be handling." She hesitated. "I took a picture of one of the pages. Just one. I don't even know why. I just had a bad feeling about it. And then, I forgot about it. Until now." Daniel's mind raced. "You think that man knows?" Emily nodded. "If he came looking for me, then yes." Daniel ran a hand down his face. "Do you still have the picture?" Emily fumbled for her phone and pulled it out. She scrolled quickly before showing him the screen. The image was a little blurry, but he could still make out a list of numbers, large amounts of money transferred between unfamiliar accounts. And at the bottom, a signature. "Rick's." Daniel let out a slow breath. "This isn't just about missing paychecks," he muttered. "Rick was involved in something bigger." Emily bit her lip. "What do we do?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He had already handled Rick. But this was something else. Something that might be bigger than all of them. He had to be smart about this. Marie cleared her throat. If you ask me, I'd say we send that picture to someone who can actually do something about it. Daniel nodded. We need to take this to the right people. He looked at Emily. I'll help you. You're not alone in this. A tear slipped down Emily's cheek, but this time it wasn't fear, it was relief. Thank you. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a card, handing it to her. That's my direct number. If anything happens, if you feel unsafe, you call me. Emily clutched the card tightly. Marie exhaled. Well, that's enough excitement for one night. She looked at the employees, who were still watching in stunned silence. All right, everyone. It was over. Back to work. Slowly, the diner returned to life. The customers went back to eating, the waitstaff resumed their tasks, and the tension that had filled the air finally began to fade. As Daniel stood there, watching the place settle, he felt something shift inside him. This had started as a simple visit, a way to see his business from a different perspective. But it had turned into something much more important. He had come here undercover to observe. Instead, he had found a broken system, a team that needed support, and a problem that ran deeper than he ever expected. And now he was going to fix it. He turned to Emily one last time. Things are going to change around here. She gave him a small, hopeful smile. I believe you. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel knew he wasn't just running a business. He was responsible for the people in it. And he wouldn't let them down.